Good morning. Last month, November 2024, China's battery exports to the United States hit a record, $1.9 billion worth for the month, which is a 27% jump year on year over last November. These are the batteries that go into electric vehicles, the lithium-ion batteries. Washington officials want to bring the entire supply chain for these batteries to the United States, and they're handing out big subsidies to companies who can get the raw materials to build them. Then, of course, the raw materials need to be refined and then assembled into batteries. These are the parts of the battery. Lithium and graphite are important components for the guts of the battery, and you have to have all these minerals as well. And the bad news is that China has near monopolies on almost all these things: nickel, copper, graphite, lithium. So keep that number in mind, that China does all that right now for under $2 billion a month. China does the mining of all these minerals, the assembly of the batteries, and the packaging and the shipments to our users in the United States. Those $1.9 billion worth of batteries are ready to be put into EVs as soon as they arrive. We hope to do all that ourselves, and our policymakers and legislators love to give big speeches about how important it all is to decouple from China's supply chains by building our own. It takes a very long time in North America to get a new mine built and producing. The engineering and the surveying can take years. Then permits and environmental waivers need to be secured from many different governmental agencies at national and local levels. Roads need to be built, water sources found, and at every point in the process, there are lawyers filing lawsuits to stop construction so their plaintiffs can be paid nuisance money to go away. People like to complain that U.S. companies outsourced production abroad to make more money, but to a large extent, they were chased out. You have to be crazy to even try to open a United States mine anymore. And Canada is even worse, given the maze of indigenous tribes there, and nobody really knows who owns the land anywhere up there. So these are realities that confront policymakers and industrial leaders back home. They're realizing that for many of these important supply chains, we don't have them anymore, and they need to be built from scratch. China owns them, and China built their supply chains over the past 3 decades when everything just cost a lot less. So investors need to be found in North America and in Europe who will put their capital at risk long term in a bid to find supplies. Another problem is that China can make large profits at price points far below our cost of production. So for new raw materials projects in our home countries to be successful, policymakers need to exclude Chinese companies from ever selling there. Tariffs of 25% or even 100% or 300%, it's still not enough to attract the investors we need and then put a moat around it after the mines are up and running. Graphite is one of those key elements used in electric vehicle batteries. Graphite is 28% of the EV battery. Researchers are experimenting with other materials that can be used instead, but for now it's graphite. And China produces almost all of the graphite. A U.S. trade group is insisting to lawmakers that in order to ever compete against China, tariffs of 920% need to be levied against Chinese graphite suppliers. Naturally, this would result in much more expensive batteries, which will cost at least twice as much. And making batteries is already 20% more expensive than doing so in China. And that's even when U.S. companies use Chinese graphite to make their batteries. The United States doesn't produce graphite. Northern Graphite, a Canadian company in Quebec, is the only producer of graphite in North America. So engineers are looking for it, but the problem is what comes after that. Even if we find a lot of graphite in the ground, it will still be expensive to get it to market compared to where Chinese prices are right now. So they are demanding roadblocks, trade barriers to keep the Chinese supplies out. This trade group is demanding basically a more than 10 times increase in the price of graphite instead of the 25% tariff rate that's effective now. But because domestic supplies for graphite cannot be found at scale, some of our largest buyers don't even pay the 25% tariff. Tesla is a huge buyer of graphite, and for the past 4 years, Tesla has asked for and received exemptions from the 25% tariff on China's graphite. Tesla, in its filings, says that no supplier outside China has the quality or capacity that Tesla needs to supply its gigafactory in Nevada. Tesla has successfully argued to be exempted from the tariff. There are 2 South Korean companies with operations in Michigan and Georgia, and they've also asked for waivers, saying they cannot source graphite outside of China. But the White House refused to extend the exemptions for these companies, so they will have to pay the 25% tariff going forward. So Tesla, LG, and SK would just pay the 25% tariffs and pass them along to their customers. It's a completely different conversation, though, if the tariff is 920%. At that level, there's no point in making batteries at all because the price will be too high. But the tariffs do need to be that high if these new mining companies have a chance. There are 3 examples here which help explain why everything just breaks down when we look at the difficulties of getting anything done in North America. Starting in June, organized protests began in Quebec over a proposed mining project there. Lomico Metals wants to build a graphite mine nearby a wildlife reserve, and this town, Duhamel. Lomico received funding of over $11 million from the Pentagon and another $5 million from Natural Resources Canada to do a feasibility study on a graphite mine project there. The Pentagon said it would be used for defense applications, which has some of the residents upset. But they don't need to worry about anything yet anyway. The surveying and feasibility studies will take place over the next 5 years, and construction may begin by 2027, subject to environmental approvals. Not anytime soon then. Down in Nevada, the U.S. Interior Department approved a lithium mine, and environmental groups are suing to stop that project. There is a wildflower, a buckwheat, and it took 6 years while regulators and environmentalists were arguing about the buckwheat. The Department of Energy kicked in $700 million along with some private equity money, and they hope construction on that mine will start in 2025 and it'll be producing by 2028. Now that's lithium, not graphite, but lithium is also critical in EV batteries. And even though the US government itself is invested in this project, it took them 6 years to go back and forth about the buckwheat that grows nearby. And there's yet another lawsuit filed to stop the project. Graphite 1 is potentially a very big project up in Alaska, but they're just getting started. So far, it's just a camp with 30 tents for 50 workers. They're drilling for samples, shipping them to Nome, and their geologists are looking for underground water to inform them where to eventually put mining pits. They're conducting a feasibility study to determine if it can be economically viable. And it was supposed to be finished by now, the end of 2024, but it's not. But even if the geologists and the accountants give it a thumbs up, next comes permitting. The permitting process will take several years and involve state and federal agencies. In Alaska, it's very difficult to get a permit compared to elsewhere. It's a lot of work, scientific work, to be completed before they can even apply for a permit. And then after that, the standards are even harder to meet. One of the problems they're already facing is that the company is using helicopters to do some of the surveying, and local tribes are complaining that the helicopters are scaring the moose, which they hunt. Some of the tribes have written to the government complaining that just the exploration activities of those 50 people are already causing big problems. Water is being taken from rivers that the salmon swim in, and the machines Graphite 1 is using are causing problems for the local wildlife there. The U.S. government also has investments in Graphite 1. Last year, the Pentagon put in $37.5 million based on a plan to build a supply chain for graphite from Alaska, processing the ore in a plant that we built in Washington State. They also want to build a recycling center. This $37 million, of course, wouldn't come close to doing any of that. It's only enough to fast track the feasibility study for a year to decide if the project is worth doing at all. And this is typical of all the big supply chain announcements that come out of Washington. Big promises about what all the money is going to do, all the big plans everyone has. This grant underscores our confidence in the strategy to build a 100% US-based advanced graphite supply chain from mining to refining to recycling. The company is now trying to raise more money. This is an offering for an equity raise of $4 million Canadian. Those are really high sales commissions too. The company will use the net proceeds to complete the feasibility study, start the permitting process, and for general corporate purposes. We should assume, I guess, that the $37 million is already almost gone, that the feasibility study isn't done yet, and all they had to show for their time and trouble so far is a herd of moose up in Alaska who hate their helicopters. But that's the problem. The feasibility study is based on graphite pricing in a world where the price for graphite is China's export price plus 25% tariffs. The math doesn't work, and so it has no chance. The demand for graphite is going vertical. Experts forecast the global demand will be 7 times higher than today, and the United States doesn't make any. In theory, there is still time to ramp up domestic mining and refining and manufacturing and ready to make markets in graphite and lithium. But everything just takes too long and everything just costs too much. And the only way out is to make sure the price stays high on all these materials for over a decade. Otherwise, investors will never get their money back, and neither will the taxpayers. One might argue that these proposed high tariffs, and by extension high prices for the graphite and for everything else inside these batteries, that these are prices worth paying if it means we can have a supply chain in country to build batteries for the electric vehicles. But here's the problem. A high price for the graphite and the other materials will destroy the domestic demand for the batteries, and by extension for the electric vehicles. Trying to keep the Chinese out requires very high tariffs or outright export bans, and that pushes the prices up, and those high prices destroy demand. It's a vicious cycle, and we've seen this play out before in electric vehicles in the United States. Toyota Motor executives say that this is the main reason their models aren't selling in the US. Toyota in New York is heavily discounting their electric SUVs. They're 40% off. And Toyota is delaying building any more in North America until at least 2026. The problem is that the high tariffs to keep Chinese cars out of the market has slowed down the development of infrastructure for all the makers of electric vehicles. EV prices in the US and Europe are $60,000. Here in China, they're under $30,000, and the prices here are still falling. And the infrastructure to support EVs are here. The infrastructure for them is being rolled out across all the markets where Chinese electric vehicles are being sold. The charging stations, the mechanic shops, and the tools and the expertise to service them. But none of that is happening in North America or Europe because the prices are so high, nobody is buying EVs at all. And this crashing demand for EVs is causing automakers there to slow everything down. This article predated the election, but it concludes that the EV market in the US won't exist until prices fall to $30,000 or below. And there are only 2 ways the prices will fall for retail buyers. Either Chinese EVs are allowed in, like they are almost everywhere else. That would drop the price. Or enormous subsidies need to be paid for Western automakers to sell their models at big losses per vehicle. If either of those things happens, though, nobody involved has incentives to pay huge premiums for US graphite at multiples the cost of what they can buy from China. We can buy EV batteries now from China for $2 billion per month. Or we can try to make all these parts ourselves, and just the raw materials are going to cost big multiples of what the Chinese companies pay. This is Hong Kong Island. Be good.